Sticking with the theme of gopher tortoise for another presentation is Heather Gaya, assessing suitability of gopher tortoise populations on working lands through the line-transect distance sampling. Is going to get into some techniques for us.
Hi, everyone. As he said, I'm Heather Gaya. I'm a PhD student at the University of Georgia. And today I'm going to be talking about how we can use line-transect distance sampling to maybe assess the stability of gopher tortoise populations, especially on working private lands. And I'd first like to acknowledge my co-authors, Brian Noose, Tom Preble, and Clinton Moore, as well as my funding sources, NRCS, Warnell, and the TWS Biometrics Working Group. So as Tom just went over, and so I don't have to as much, the gopher tortoise is this lovely medium-sized tortoise that's found in the southeastern United States. It's found all the way up from South Carolina over to Louisiana and down into most of Florida. It builds these extensive burrows, digs these extensive burrows in the sandy soil sort of associated with the longleaf pine ecosystems. And those burrows can then be used by over 365 other species for a variety of habitat uses. So they're pretty important to the ecosystem overall. But they're found to be declining range-wide. They're currently listed as threatened in that sort of red portion of their range over there. Oh, I can even use a little pointer. Oh, no. Oh, yes. Sorry. They're listed as federally threatened in the red portion of the range, but everywhere else they are currently being considered for a federal listing. So it's kind of important for us to understand how these populations are doing, and especially since so much of the land in the southeast is owned privately, it would be nice to get more data on those lands and maybe find a way that we could assess stability without having to go back repeatedly for 50 years to each individual landowner, because they might not appreciate that very much. And so the minimum population targets that we're kind of looking at for what would we consider a stable or like minimally stable gopher tortoise population would be at least 250 adults, a density of at least 0.4 tortoises per hectare, just so they can interact with each other and have some hope of reproducing. We want to see evidence of active recruitment, and we want to see a representation of all of the age classes, so some juveniles, some subadults, and some adults. But as I mentioned, a lot of these things are going to be easier if you can go back to a population multiple times, but we wanted to kind of develop a strategy for how you might kind of assess stability from line-transect distance sampling if you can only visit a property a few times. And so I keep mentioning line-transect distance sampling. And so essentially what this is that it would be ideal if we could go out into the world and count every single tortoise that's on the landscape, but that's not ever really going to happen because they're hard to find, and that would take forever. So line-transect distance sampling, essentially, if you assume there are all these tortoises, they're out there in the world in their little burrows, and then we throw down a bunch of transects and we walk along them, and what we can do is that we can use the relationship that objects that are closer to you are easier to see than objects that are farther away to estimate the actual area that you're surveying to the left and right when you walk down these transects. So as you walk down this known length of transect, you then can get a distance to every object that you find, in this case a tortoise burrow, and then we can collect some additional information on those tortoise burrows. So we generally take the occupancy, is a tortoise actually in there, as well as the size of the burrow, because in gopher tortoises, size scales with age, at least up to a point. So in general, larger burrows are going to be adults and smaller burrows are going to be juveniles, and they'll get bigger as they get older. But the problem with this sort of raw data and just using this for population estimates is that it's a lot easier to see a larger burrow that's about 50 centimeters wide than it is to see something that's 5 centimeters wide. And we miss them a lot, especially even directly under your feet. You can walk over a tiny tortoise burrow and never even know it was there. And so if you look at this graph here, this is just sort of an example of how we might have a true population here in red, which has some adults, a few subadults, and the spike of juveniles. But when we go out there and use this line-transect distance sampling, all that we find is a ton of adults and then only a few of these other size classes. And this is concerning because it means when you go out to a population and you find just a small number of these juveniles, you don't really know, is it that I just missed all the juveniles, or are there actually no juveniles in this population? So the goal of our project was, first of all, to find a way to correct for this bias in our sampling so that we could get an idea of the age structure of the population that we're surveying. And then secondly, compare that to what we would think a stable population would look like and ask, is the property that we've gone out to and surveyed, is that a stable population? So to begin with, we built a Bayesian hierarchical model. And essentially what this is doing is just taking all the information that we found out in the field, so the distance of these objects to ourselves, as well as the size of the burrows that we found, and it's leveraging it against detection probability. It's telling the model, I know that these are what I found, but this isn't actually an accurate estimation of what's going on in the world. I know I was biased towards those larger, closer animals. And then it asks the model, well, what were all of those burrows that I didn't see? What were their sizes? What were their distances? What did they look like out in the world? And so we looked at burrow sizes, this mixture of gamma distributions, to kind of get an idea of those sort of bumps that we might see for the different age classes. And one of the advantages of also using this model is that not only do we get a better idea of the age distribution of our population instead of that raw data, but we're also able to get a better idea of the abundance and density of these tortoises on the landscape. And this is because we're no longer missing all of those tiny tortoises, so we're able to get a better idea of what that population might look like. And so we found in simulation that this was actually fairly effective at getting the true, or at least close to a true estimate of the population from that biased data. And so what you might see in our, in our observed biased raw data would be this blue bump going on. Again, that's going to be just like mostly those adults, maybe a few juveniles and subadults. But then when you ask the model, hey, what did that true distribution look like? It will give you this pink distribution instead, saying, well, there are still a large number of adults. They are mostly adults in the population, but there's still this spike of juveniles and subadults that you missed initially during that survey. And so now we've solved sort of that initial problem of, well, we had all this biased data. So now we have data that we can work with to then assess how might this sample population that we're looking at, is that going to be stable? What's going on these private lands? And so we built a matrix population model, and it was obviously slightly more complex than this implies, but essentially we used published growth rates, published survival estimates, and recruitment for gopher tortoises, especially in the sort of the central section of their range, particularly Georgia, but really could be expanded a little bit out from there. And this would just give us an idea of what we think a stable population would look like. Again, those targets of 250 adults, kind of that density of what those size classes would look like. And then we asked the model that we'd created, well, what would the relative proportion of these varying size classes look like in the, or age classes look like in the population for a stable distribution? So what would the relative proportion of juveniles, subadults, and adults look like? And we ran this multiple times, so you're going to see that there's a range of values that are possible depending on the parameters that you put into that model. And so for gopher tortoises, we found that this is sort of what our stable age distribution might look like. And this is probably not the most familiar format, so I'm going to go over it. But essentially, this is looking at the proportion of those different age classes in the population. So if I'm all the way up here, I'm 100% adults, and I have no subadults and no juveniles. If I were directly in the center, that would be about 33% of each of those age classes in the population. And so what we found was that, according to our model, a stable age distribution for gopher tortoises would probably fall somewhere in this 95% convex hole. So we're imagining that it's a little bit off of that central 33% of each one, but just a little bit more juveniles than that true value. But of course, there's some variety, some uncertainty because of the way this was modeled. So it probably falls just somewhere in that general range. And then we can ask, so we know kind of what our target is here that we're looking for. It's this convex hole right here. But what does that sample that we collected from that private land look like? And so we can take this same sort of approach and take that estimate that we produced earlier from the model, pull out the MCMC chain, and get a general idea of, well, our sample is probably somewhere in here. And of course, when you're going out and sampling and you have to adjust for this bias, and depending on how many transects you put out and how many individuals you saw, you're going to have a great deal of more uncertainty than you would of that model where everything is known. But this essentially can tell us, well, this is probably where that sample population is that we just looked at. And this is the estimated composition. So at least for this theoretical population that we've gone out and surveyed, maybe it's a little bit closer to that central area than the true distribution, than the stable distribution was, but not looking too bad over here. And then all we have to do is just combine those two convex holes and ask, do they overlap? And so this, again, this blue is that stable age distribution. This is sort of what we're aiming for, what we would hope that a population with lambda equals 1 would look like. And then this pink area is the estimated composition of what we think our population that we went out and surveyed looks like. And you can see that there is some overlap. And so the more overlap that we have, the more certain we are that, yes, we're dealing with a stable population. And then, of course, this could be expanded to different lambdas that you might be interested in. So maybe this is just looking at lambda equals 1, but maybe lambda equals 0.95 is sufficient, or maybe you want to know about populations that are growing. And so, again, you could just rerun that matrix model for whatever lambda you are looking at, and could get, maybe it's over here probably for growing populations, and maybe a little bit more this way for populations that are closer to that 1, but a little bit below it. And just as a point of interest, if we had just taken that raw data that we had collected and we hadn't adjusted for bias at all, our estimate would have been all the way up here. So we wouldn't have been anywhere. We would have thought that we were nowhere near this target that we're aiming for. So that really just, that might seem extreme in this sort of like theoretical example here, but in simulation, we saw that it's very possible to be extremely biased and not realize it. And so just kind of hitting home that it's important to really correct for that bias in your survey before you go through this technique. And so just sort of in conclusion, we think that this as a framework is potentially a very powerful tool for estimating population stability as just a snapshot. And again, it's difficult, to just take information from one survey and say this is how the population is doing forever. But we think that this could be a solution to properties where you can only go out once or twice to survey the land and get some idea of what's going on. And this might especially be useful if we're considering how we're going to devote resources or which properties we should put into the Working Lands for Wildlife program, for instance. Maybe there are going to be some populations that are just so far in one direction away from stable that maybe that might not be the best use of our time or money. Or maybe there are ones that are actually growing, and those would be the ones that we would want to focus on. And we're hoping that this framework could then be expanded to different growth rates or different species. So at least for gopher tortoises in the Florida, tortoises are going to be growing at a slightly different rate than those tortoises in South Carolina, just because of that temperature gradient and different habitat characteristics that they're going to be interacting with. And of course, it's important to recognize again that this is just a model, just a snapshot of the population, and that a lot of factors can change between your first time that you go out and 20 years from now. But it might be hopefully a useful assessment tool. And I would like to thank everybody who gave me funding for this, of course, and everybody who worked on this project. And since it seems that I'm a little bit ahead of time, just like to pitch our shiny app. And so essentially what we thought is that, well, landowners might not want to be, or, managers might not want to be going around doing all this Bayesian modeling. So maybe we could make their lives a little bit easier. And essentially what this does is it's just like a standalone app that you can download on if you have a Windows computer. And you can just put in 2 CSV files for your burrow data and your transect data, or if you have any habitat covariates, you can add them in as well. And then you say, this is how long I'm willing to wait for those results to pop out. And then you can just press go. And in 8 to 18 hours, it will produce a estimate of your density, your abundance, and also if that population is falling within that stable age distribution. So with that, I'll take questions. Thank you.
We have some time. So how many are enrolled Working Lands for Wildlife projects you think fit within your modeled distribution of viable population?
Well, as we saw from Tom's talk, yeah, there's a wide variety out there. I wouldn't say it's that all of them are going to fit in that, but I don't know. I haven't looked at much of them. Tom was
to estimate that. You think?
The estimate
like how close are we to doing right by this species?
Yeah, could we take averages and put them in there?
Oh, yeah.
Individual sets?
Yeah, I feel like it would be, you could probably run each individual site and then see how well it's doing. That might take a little bit of time.
You have time.
But, yeah, I'm just a grad student. I don't do anything.
My sites are pretty small, so I was more focused on the habitat. So,
Yeah, this would probably require initial field work. Yeah. But. Oh, yes.
First of all, I thought your modeling approach was very clever. I haven't seen anything like that, so that was really cool. So it looked like you're modeling or comparing your sites based on your matrix model around a lambda of 1. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Any sense, and I know you didn't analyze this, but even maybe literature, what you would have to do to push lambda beyond 1?
Yeah, so I think in what is probably going to be the, I guess tortoises are a long-lived species, so is kind of, the literature shows that as they get older, they get, their reproductive ability is like, they're more successful at reproducing, and they can, they're better parents. I mean, they just sort of lay eggs and then leave them, but they're better at being tortoises as they get older. So, if you were trying to like conserve a target, you'd probably want to like have more of those adults. But what we found is that if you kind of look at, there's sort of this underlying, we allowed fecundity to range from different values. And when we allowed tortoises to have more successful eggs per tortoise, they kind of tended to be more on this portion of that 95% convex hull. So my gut feeling would be that if you could increase reproduction overall, then you would probably have more likely to have a growing population. Yeah, so there are a lot of predators to the gopher tortoise in the southeast. There's fire ants will get the babies, raccoons, there's dogs, but what? Wild hogs? Yeah, wild hogs will disturb just the general area, get some alligators occasionally. But yeah, I think a lot of it is really just if you can manage the habitat overall. Habitat loss, I think, is their main threat currently. So.